Dr. Mazza. I'm very happy that you found time to join my podcast. And there's an interesting coincidence that some people from your podcast were guests on my podcast because I've been living in Jordan and Amman for the past 28, 29 years. And my interest is the Middle Eastern politics and Middle Eastern history. However, what we know about the Italian involvement in 20th century and for how long you've been studying the contemporary history of the Middle East?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Well, I've been working on sort of Middle East in general, but very much focusing on Palestine and Israel for the past 20 years. In fact, a little longer than that. I moved to London to take a master at the School of Oriental and African Studies in 2002, and then that spiraled into a complete different ideas about my career, which eventually, became an academic one. So yeah, it's definitely more than 20 years I've been working on several topics regarding the Middle East in general, but more importantly, focusing on Palestine and Israel.
How can we distinguish Palestine from Israel and Israel from Palestine? Because historically, the territory, which is nowadays separated between Israel and Palestinian Authority and Hamas run Gaza, used to be the part of Greater Syria for many centuries.
Indeed. This is one of those tricky questions, and as I teach classes using a lot of maps, I also, be very aware of the dangerous ground when you start talking about names and maps and pointing to all of that together. I mean, obviously, when we talk about Palestine, we're talking about an historical region which more or less is what today is State of Israel, with the addition of Gaza, the West Bank, and maybe some surrounding areas. But again, this is a map that does not really have any precise historical connotations from the past. The region was named Palestine by the Romans, picking up the name of the ancient people of the Philistine. Obviously, for the local Jewish populations, has always been Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, even though it was divided in the various regions, Judea, Samaria, which obviously Samaria was, part of this Jewish territory, even though they, let's say, performed Judaism in a different way, and they had their own holy sites. Now, moving forward in time, what is interesting is that indeed the land has been named Palestine mostly by Christians throughout the centuries, and the name remains, whether it was Byzantine rules or Arab rule, so certainly connected with some areas of what nowadays we call Palestine. What is interesting, if we come to the modern time, again, this was the name that was picked up by the British, when they created the Mandate in 1922. Under the Ottomans, probably many listeners know that there was no real Palestine in administrative terms. We're talking about sanjaks or provinces, whether it was the Sanjak of Jerusalem or Nablus and Accra. But certainly the idea of Palestine existed within this larger frame of Bilad Hasham, so sort of a greater Syria. And then you had this, again, region which did not really exist in administrative term of southern Syria. But, these are all terms that people used almost interchangeably, depending on the context, depending who they were talking to. But definitely an idea of a territory, an area with, undefined borders, but certainly within sort of borders that we know nowadays existed, certainly among the local populations, which called Philistine. I mean, it's not a surprise that we have publications like a newspaper being published already from the very beginning of the 20th century called Al-Filastin, but also in letters, memoirs, diaries, this is a name that is widely used, not necessarily by everybody. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody identified with that name, but it was a name which was common to identify the region. We have to remember that today we think in terms of nation states. We give ourselves identity based on certain labels that we created in the 20th century and more importantly after World War II. But not necessarily people identify themselves, according to a nationality or a specific, a large identity. I always like to talk about, the work of Benedict Anderson with my students. There is emerging communities, which really tells us about the fact that, communities identify first and foremost with the small community around. So if I think my own country, first we tend to identify with the village, the town we are born and grow up, and then later on maybe we become Italian at some point. And this is true for many other places, and Palestine is one of them. People first define themselves as Jerusalemites or Nabulsi from Nablus, or depending where they're from, really. And then the other layer came into place when maybe dealing with foreigners, or depending on the people we're talking to, so the degree of knowledge of Yemen. But it's important to acknowledge that there was this term Palestine, which obviously is important. But if we think about the British, certainly the British created the borders of modern day Palestine, which eventually came to coincide with the borders of Israel and with all of the division. But the borders are an artificial creation again. Under the Ottomans, those borders did not exist. The British originally included Transjordan, where you're sitting now, and eventually what that was carved out for political reasons. So again, the borders of Palestine were flexible because there was no such a thing as a fixed idea of Palestine as well. Just to make the comparison, which I think is important given the times, that when we talk about Erez Israel, so the land of Israel, again, that's an identity. It's mostly a religious identity connected to a land.
It is religious identity. Also,
exactly.
People are making a mistake by equating biblical Jews with modern day Israelis and modern day settlers who came from places like Ethiopia or Eastern Europe or America, because this is more of a religious concept than ethnic concept or concept based on race or nationality. Of course, we're entering into another topic which is very important and very divisive. Some people will disagree with me. I'm very aware of that. But how Italian cultural diplomacy worked in Palestine between 1918 and 1938? You wrote about that. Yeah, you wrote about that in the book European Cultural Diplomacy and Arab Christians. I remember that book was advertised by the British Institute in Amman, CBRL, and it was published a few years ago.
Yes, there was a collective effort by a number of scholars, led by Karen Sanchez, based in the Netherlands. Now, the whole point was to look at cultural influences in Palestine, mostly upon the Christians, upon the Christian communities, but in general upon Palestine. And my work was focusing on Italian cultural diplomacy, mostly because the archives dealing with Italian presence in Palestine had been recently reorganized and made available. And so all of the material of the Italian consulate in Jerusalem became available to scholars. And I was one of the first, in fact, one of the few, at the very beginning to avail all of this material. And what is interesting is to see that there are different layers. Italian presence in Palestine has been important for centuries, mostly from a religious point of view. First, because you have plenty of clergy, travelers, but it also has been defined in religious terms. So again, the custos, so the leader of the Franciscans in Terra Santa, the Holy Land based in Jerusalem, is Italian by constitution. So are a number of brothers of the Franciscans. In 1847, since the reopening of the Catholic Patriarchate of Jerusalem, the patriarch has always been an Italian, with the exceptions in the 80s and 90s of a Palestinian patriarch, but even nowadays, the patriarch is Italian. So we can see there is a connection and a long presence of Italians in the Holy Land, in Palestine, mostly for religious purposes. With the beginning of the 19th century, that really didn't change, despite Italy began to, after unification, began to play a role on the international stage. And Italy took an interest in what was going on in the Ottoman Empire, as they were interested in maybe conquering, occupying, taking over, influencing the Ottoman Empire, all sorts of ideas. Eventually, in 1911, the Italians, I would say, tried. They conquered Libya, but it was obviously not exactly an easy exercise. That war ended up pretty badly, even though Italian troops were, settled in Libya. The Italians also took over the Dodecanese Islands from the Ottoman Empire, which is part of Greece nowadays. And that's a key moment where you can see a growing interest of the Italian governments, by then, let's call them Italian liberal governments, in Palestine. But again, is not comparable with the role of France or Britain. They are the dominant political forces in the region. Italy became a little bit more prominent with the advent of fascism. And that's where you can see that Mussolini understood the value of propaganda and essentially staged a number of operations that were directly trying to influence both the Arabs and the Zionists. And I think this is very important. Up until 1938, essentially, the fascist government tried to influence both sides in different ways. Through the establishment of Radio Bari, which was based in Bari, which is a city in the south of Italy, which predated even the creation of a BBC service in the region, and essentially through that playing Arabic music, but also trying to spread essentially anti-British propaganda to convince the Arabs that to be under Italian rule would have been better. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex than this, but just to highlight the role of these cultural campaigns. And at the same time, the fascist government was working with the Zionist organizations. In fact, they organized exchanges where you have, teachers, Italian teachers, obviously of Jewish descent, going to Palestine, mostly to settle in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to teach Italian. And so you can also see the spread of Italian culture through the opening of the schools, whether Zionist schools, Arab schools, and indeed Catholic Christian schools. Again, is not the same enterprise as the British, as of the French. They are at a different level, but you can certainly see the work of the Italian fascist government try to set a foot in Palestine and to leave a print over there. And I like to highlight here a point that is not necessarily about culture, but is a legacy of the Italian fascist involvement in the region. And it's a dual one. One, obviously, is the financial support given to Arab organizations, which eventually were very active in the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. And what is very interesting and fascinating is at the very same time, the Italian fascist government hosted a number of Zionists in Civitavecchia, which is a port outside Roma, where these individuals, mostly belonging to the Beitar organization, which was a paramilitary organization of fascist inspirations, they were trained by the Italian Navy. And eventually in 1948, they became the backbone of the newly created Israeli Navy. And so it's very interesting to see how Italian involvement was marching on parallel tracks. And as I argued in my own work, eventually showing that they were consistently inconsistent. Essentially, they never really able to achieve anything because there was no consistency. They were trying to do multiple things at the same time with an unclear goal in mind, other than creating sympathy for Italy, which eventually never materialized because, as we know, particularly with the outbreak of World War II, both Arabs and Zionists did not support Italy. And so eventually all of that money, all of that campaigns, all of that efforts did not bring anything to the Italian fascist state in terms of results. There's a memory and there's a legacy, which obviously as historians, we have a duty to unpack and see how, that work came to influence people in the long term.
How well are documented the collaboration between Beta and fascist organizations and Zev Jabotinsky, who was the head of revisionist Zionism, which later on became the modern day Likud politicians.
Exactly.
Politicians like
first of all, there's an
Tate.
interesting
Yes, please.
There's an interesting episode about Jabotinsky that a lot of people neglect. The fact that actually spoke Italian and he studied in Rome well before, going to Palestine and becoming the leader of the sort of revisionist Zionist movement.
Yeah.
Now, we don't know. We don't know much about his presence in Italy. He was supposed to go to university. He really didn't go. And obviously fascism was not yet a political force. So we don't know exactly who he met, whether he had the chance to meet people that became relevant later in the fascist party. That's a gray area. But it's important that there is already a connection with Italy, which becomes very strong later on when obviously in 1920, the fascist party became stronger and stronger. And obviously we have the creation of the first Italian fascist government and the establishment of a full regime. Now, in terms of a Beitar, what is interesting is that the facilitations between Beitar and the fascist government was done by the local consulate. So we have two consuls working in the 1920s, and essentially what they do, they get in touch with a number of organizations, and both consuls working at this time, they are fascist supporters, and so they're very interested in also spreading fascist ideology in the region. And I think it's important to highlight that at this point, fascism is not involved in any anti-Jewish, say, anti-Semitic policy. Historically, we know that there's a number of Jews that are supporters of fascism, and that narrative became dominant only in the late 30s when we have establishment of a Nazi party in Germany, and obviously the relationship between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy became stronger, and eventually Mussolini, who we should remember, he had a Jewish mistress for quite some time. He adopted the infamous racial laws of 1938. But up to that point, we can safely say that actually Mussolini was looking at Zionism, and particularly revisionist Zionism, with favor, mostly in anti-British terms. He understood Zionism as well as Arab nationalism as faces of the same coins that would have helped him to overthrow the British, or certainly to diminish their influence in the Mediterranean region. So, it's a complex discourse here to understand.
Yeah.
So once the connection was established, actually, we know that Jabotinsky tried to meet Mussolini, but that meeting never took place. Nevertheless, the connection was made, and through the Beitar, which also became eventually the Beitar Jerusalem, the infamous soccer team nowadays playing in Jerusalem, the anti-Arab team, a number of young men were sent to train in the Italian Navy. And again, we have plenty of material, exchange of letters about the programs, where the people involved. So again, it's part of this kind of cultural campaigns. Obviously, this one in particular is a military campaign with the idea of providing training to young men who, but somehow in the future, according to obviously the fascist regime, could have helped the fascist effort in the region. 1938 changed everything. With the adoption of the racial laws, this program was disbanded. I found some interesting documents where, in fact, many were disappointed. The program was going well, friendships were created, and there was sort of at a human level, the trainers were not convinced about the racial laws. And again, this resonates well in Italy. The racial rules were never really fully implemented up until 1943 when the Nazi occupied Italy. But nevertheless, that relationship came to an end with the racial laws of 1938. But as I said, the long-term legacy is that those people, those individuals had been trained by the Italian Navy, and that knowledge and skills were, came to be handy in 1948 when eventually an Israel Navy was created, and those individuals could use their knowledge and skills that learned a decade earlier under the fascist regime.
We also have the initiative to build different Italian hospitals, not only in Jaffa, but we have the Italian hospital in the downtown of Amman. We have the Italian hospital in Karak. Was that a kind of the Italian soft power in the Middle East, in Palestine, and in general in Levant?
Indeed. I mean, we have to remember that since the unification of Italy in 1871, what is important is church and state were not only technically separated, but really at war with each other. The Vatican did not recognize the Italian state, and yet they worked together through organizations, and many of these organizations actually worked in the Middle East. You have not just the Catholic Church at large, but smaller organizations within the Catholic Church which had interest in promoting a pilgrimage and a presence, again, in competition mostly with French Catholics and Spanish Catholics too, in order to establish institutions. So it's from literally the late 19th century that we see the emergence of Italian schools, Italian hospitals. All they had in mind to attract locals. So these institutions were not targeting Italians in the regions, even because we can't really talking about an Italian presence. The numbers are minimal. But, the idea was to create a connection, so soft power, through which, these individuals, they would convert to Catholicism if they were not Catholics, particularly if they were Greek Orthodox, and or came to support Italian presence in the region, should it develop. Again, most of these programs were developed in a time where no one could have predicted that the Ottoman Empire was going to disappear in 1918. So this was very much about, as you said it, soft power, influence, presence. For Italian Catholics, what was very important was to challenge the French the French protections over the Catholics in the Holy Land. That was really the main goal. And one of the ways to do that was to build schools, build hospitals, offer services to the local populations. And we see that, obviously, Jaffa, Karak in Jordan. Eventually, we also have an hospital, which never really functioned as an hospital, other for a short period of time, open in Jerusalem, which was built by the famous Italian architect Antonio Barluzzi. And the building was literally a copy of Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Today, that building is occupied by the Israeli Minister of Education, but it functioned as an hospital, towards the end of the Ottoman era and for a short period of time under the British. Again, schools, but more than schools, what we also see is the offering of programs. So the competition was not just opening a building, but offering different programs, modern programs, not just about learning a language or a religion, but technical subjects. And so what we see is this high competition between the French, the British, the Jewish schools, the German schools, the Italian one. But it must be said that when you look at the greater picture, despite the emphasis and certainly the efforts, the Italians were always at the bottom of all of these efforts, mostly because they didn't receive money from the government. The government, after the unification, could not afford to invest money in this kind of enterprises. Italy was a very poor country, other than the north. This is the period where we have around historians talk about maybe between 10 to 15 million Italians moving in about 75, 50 to 70 years, moving abroad to America, Latin America. So obviously, the Italian government really couldn't afford to invest money in these kind of programs like the French or the British did. And so all of these programs, the bills were picked up essentially by these Catholic organizations, which were funded by, the faithfuls through collections in churches. And so, in a sense, while you see the effort and you see tons of letters in the archives, but the letters are not followed by action. So there's a lot of wishful thinking. But other than that, you don't really see much of Italian presence developing throughout the region, other than, again, some of the hospitals and some of the schools, and some of them survived throughout the mandate, but then eventually, they all disappeared with the outbreak of World War II.
What were relations between Grand Mufti Husseini and Italian fascist government? We know very well that later on, Grand Mufti became a major Muslim collaborator with Hitler. He organized SS Skanderbeg and Hanja division made of Balkan Muslims. So his role is well known, and he's one of the main Christians or collaborators among Muslims. Of course, we cannot say that the Grand Mufti was a fascist or a Nazi by his ideology, but he definitely collaborated against Zionists and against the British Empire by collaborating with Hitler and Mussolini.
He did. I mean, obviously, he also, spent some time in Italy. But let me clarify a couple of points here, because I think this is very important. You talked about the fact that he was able to gather divisions of Balkan Muslims.
Yeah.
What is important to highlight, given also the period of time we're living in, that he was not able to mobilize any Arab Muslim soldier troops in Palestine.
Yeah.
And I think this is very important to highlight also these kind of differences, where he certainly was an important figure appointed by the British, and he played a major role, as spreading the gospel of fascism and Nazism, even though, as you said, I believe he was not personally. He was mostly interested in these ideologies as anti-British and anti-Zionist.
Yes.
But, through his writing, through his speeches, it's hard to say that he was a fascist or a Nazi. I mean, there are also lots of inconsistencies even between his figure and these ideologies. But I think it's very important to highlight that he was not really able to be successful in Palestine in that sense. Obviously, Italy provided him with a platform. Again, Radio Bari was one of them. Italy provided him and Arab bands connected to the Grand Mufti with weapons and funds. So obviously there is this kind of connection. Again, in the late 30s, and obviously we're moving, closer to the period of the war, where Italians understood his figure, and they understood that he could have been useful and very interesting. I want to say as useful as Jabotinsky on the other side, essentially in an anti-British understanding of all of this. I don't believe that really Mussolini had a great view and opinion of Agel Hussein. I mean, I don't think they could have, shared the same room and find more agreements other than we want the British out.
And we want Zionists
but certainly,
out. This is what was his major goal. He was capable of collaborating and signing a pact with anyone who would get rid of Zionists. That was his major goal. If someone else appeared in 1930s and 1940s, instead of Nazis and fascists, he would embrace them. This is the argument against people who think that Mufti Husseini was genuinely a Nazi or a fascist, which
And
I
let me
disagree
say
with that.
this.
Yeah,
Let me because in Italy, and I guess myself too, we've been all influenced by a famous historian, Renzo De Felice, who wrote a large number of books about Mussolini. And obviously, also he looked at the question of the Jews and the Arabs, and he made a very compelling argument saying that, look, yes, he was anti-Zionist, he was anti-Jewish. We can include him into the big category of anti-Semitism. But when he's looking at the question of Nazi and fascist ideology, basically says, look, he just, use the famous sentence, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And essentially, like, look, I'm not a fascist, I'm not a Nazi, but your enemies are the British and later on became the Jews and the Zionists, because I said earlier, there's a complexity. The Italian fascist regime supported the Zionist movement. So there's a complexity here that has to be understood. And eventually, with the outbreak of the war, here you are. I mean, obviously, it was very convenient for him to just be closer to these two individuals, Mussolini and Hitler. But again, I tend to agree with De Felice that we should not ascribe the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to the Nazi fascist ideology. It was a practical choice, a relationship that was a necessity for the goals that he wanted to achieve, which was basically to get rid of the British first and the Zionists from Palestine.
absolutely, absolutely. And I also think that as a politician, he made lots of blunders, and his position and his choice of world powers that were supposed to protect Arab rights in Palestine were totally wrong, and he wasn't a very, very far-sighted person, because 100th Division and the Skanderberg Division were mobilized in the late 1943 when World War II was already decided. So they were fighting in the last phase of the World War II, when it was a matter of the of steps and ways how they're going to defeat Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Japan. And for the end, for the last 6 minutes, what would you say about Italian soft power in 1930s and 1920s in the Middle East, of course?
It's less of a soft power. I
Yeah,
mean, in my view, the very fact that they began to send money and weapons is no longer a cultural sort of influence, but there is a direct attempt to influence the region, to not just get the hearts of the people, but also to get the hands and the minds of the people to switch and support an Italian cause. And I think we have to remember a couple of things going on here. First of all, fascist ideology, which looked at the Mediterranean as this idea of Mare Nostrum, going
of
back
course.
to the Romans.
Yeah,
Obviously, that would have been complex with the northern part of the Mediterranean, with Spain and France. But all of the northern African and Middle Eastern lands were basically up for grab, according to
of course.
Mussolini. And the example is Libya, and which is the second element to take into account. Uh, Libya was occupied by Italian forces, but we also know that they found a lot of resistance. And essentially, the Italians were trying to convince not just the Libyans, but all Muslims around that an Italian presence in Libya was beneficial to the local people.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of like dual attempts, one which is software, in a sense, the attempt to convince Arab Muslims that Italian presence was benevolent. And at the same time, they began to use less soft power and more hard power, money and weapons, in order to overthrow the local regimes, whether it were run by the British or the French, or in any way to create the conditions for which the Italians would play a major role. Remember, again, think about the crisis in the late 30s, particularly after the takeover by Hitler, and eventually what you have is Mussolini trying to play the deal breaker between Nazi Germany, Czechoslovakia, the British, the French, and essentially Mussolini was trying to do the same in the Middle East, using different form of powers, but the goal was the same: to get to that point where Mussolini was needed in order to sort out all the problems, and you would see a growing Italian presence in the region. But as I said, I mean, in the end, Mussolini probably never really invested enough time, efforts, money to send the right people. And despite the claims of Mare Nostrum and to be a powerhouse in the Mediterranean, when we look at the documents and we try to see what they tried to do, we can see that it was a minimal amount of effort that was sent over there, and never matched the claims. So on one hand you have claims, propaganda, but the reality was very different.
Maybe in our next talk we can discuss relations between Arab Christians and Italy, because
absolutely that's a fascinating one too.
It is, because there is Italian presence, religious presence in the Holy Land, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and you mentioned Franciscans, and the role Franciscans are playing here. Also, Italian scholars, even though Italy doesn't have a research center like the UK or the US, still has lots of lots of scholars, archaeologists, historians who study this region. So maybe next time we can talk about that.
Absolutely. A pleasure. It's a fascinating topic with a lot of things to say, because Italian presence may not be as organized as others, particularly in terms of religious groups and cultural organizations, and yet it's very visible. And I think it's just worth mentioning that the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Father Pizzaballa, who was previously the custos of the Franciscans, is a major political player in the region nowadays. I mean, he's someone that is being named many times by both Palestinians and Israelis, because obviously he plays a major role in the region.
Of course. Thank you so much, and we're going to talk soon in the future. I think very soon we're going to discuss issues related to Palestine and the whole land in general. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
All the best.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.